Thank you all for welcoming the American Conservative Union to Iowa. We are really pleased to be here. I'm a Midwesterner myself. I grew up in Kansas, so of course we always looked up to Iowa as our sort of superior ag state, but it's a real pleasure to be back. Obviously, every presidential election cycle, Iowa becomes the center of the universe. And right now I think you've got at least 21 people who are circulating to the state constantly trying to explain why Iowans should vote for each of these individual candidates. We are pleased to be here today with some of the leading experts on national security and foreign policy issues, as well as economic security and innovation. We're pleased to present these people to you so that they can share their ideas with you and we can have a good conversation, explore these topics. There's not going to be unanimity of opinion. There are going to be some differences of opinion and disagreements, and that's a good thing. More importantly, for the direction of our country, this is an opportunity for you to learn and then to try to influence these 21 presidential candidates who you see on a daily and weekly basis. Iowans have a unique opportunity really to help direct the future of our country. And these are some of the most critical times our nation has ever experienced. So please, listen carefully, learn, form opinions, and be prepared to press these candidates on some of these issues, the issues that matter most to us. Before I introduce Gordon Chang, who is going to moderate and participate in the first panel, I want to thank Millie Hallow and the National Rifle Association for their support. We couldn't be here today without them. I also want to thank Dan Rockter with the public. Dan, or Don, where are you? There you are. They have been phenomenal supporters of conservatism in the state. We do have some sad news to share. Dave Stanley passed away yesterday. A real rock in the state. And so we dedicate this forum today in his memory for all the good work that he did in this state, promoting sound ideas across all the conservative issues in the spectrum of policy. He'll be missed. But his legacy is well-founded and will continue to live on in the state. With that said, the things he fought for were the ideas that Reagan educated all of us on. The idea of the Reagan doctrine. People are starting to re-engage in this idea. What was the Reagan doctrine? We can talk about peace through strength, but what did that mean? Well, it meant a strong military, of course, and prudent use of that military. But you can't have a strong military without a strong economy, and a strong economy requires entrepreneurship and innovation. Without that freedom, you cannot build a robust system. And peace through strength also requires a strong culture. In the end, the only thing that's worth fighting for is a healthy society. So a healthy society requires freedom of the individual and freedom of expression. And when we have that, then it's worth fighting for. But the only way to fight for that is to have the military means to do so. So these issues are all built on each other. They hinge on each other. So our first panel today will talk about those foreign policy and national security issues. Gordon Chang is with us today, and it is such a privilege to welcome him. You can't see, if you turn on your television set at any point in the last month, you have seen Gordon Chang. He's everywhere, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, everywhere, because he is the nation's leading authority on Asia and China and what's going on with their economies and the security ramifications of those things. So Gordon is with Forbes magazine, and he's also a fellow with the American Conservative Union. Gordon, it is really such a pleasure. I will let you take it over from here and introduce your fellow panelists.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for coming today. I have the honor of introducing the best panel in the world. And we're going to start with Amanda Bellows, who is an American and Russian historian, and she is... Oh, okay. Our next panelist is Jeff Balaban. He is the CEO of B2 Strategic, and he is the chairman of the Iron Dome Alliance, which is a super PAC dedicated to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and he is a senior fellow of the ACU Foundation. And finally, we have Joseph Humeyer, who is a Latin American expert, and he is the director of a Center for a Secure and Free Society. At a time of pessimism and even defeatism, Ronald Reagan changed the tone in America, and then he changed the world. In the Nixon and Carter eras, accommodationists ruled. They just told us that we had to accept the Soviet Union. But Reagan disagreed. He believed in free markets, free societies, and he did not take the Soviet Union as a given. And because of that, we lived in a safer and more prosperous world. But today, we live in a very troubled environment. Some of the dangers we face are different than those of the Reagan eras. Some of them are the same. But unfortunately, policymakers, both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, have forgotten Reagan's core message, that the nature of regimes matters. At this moment, Americans are preparing to elect a new president, and because of that, the conversation begins again about how do we secure the world, and of course, protect America. Now, one question that will inevitably arise in this discussion, it already has arisen, is what is the greatest threat to the United States? And I'm going to start with Amanda because she has some firm ideas about this issue. Amanda?
Today, I would argue there are two main candidates, Iran and Russia. I believe that Iran poses the most immediate threat to the United States and to the stability of the world, particularly if it becomes a nuclear power because of its aggressive nature. However, I'd like to point out that the incoming Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford Jr., has labeled Russia the foremost existential threat to the United States. Although Russia has been a partner of the United States in a number of ways during the 21st century, it has acted like a rogue nation during recent decades by grabbing land. For instance, consider the recent annexation of Crimea in 2014, and by indirectly funding terrorism through its support of nations like Iran, which backs organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. Russia's present interests conflict with our own in many ways. For instance, Russia is a huge exporter of arms to countries in the Middle East, like Syria, where there are myriad problems, such as the rise of ISIS. And if the Iran deal goes through, Russia's looking forward to selling more arms to Iran and has recently announced its intention to do so. Finally, because of Putin's desire to restore territory lost by Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia also threatens to disrupt the stability of Eastern Europe, most notably in Ukraine.
And then you are a Ukraine expert. Now, Jeff, you look at the world in somewhat different light, if I can see. I mean, how do you rack up the threats the United States faces?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a difference in degree or in kind, but there's a little bit of a difference for sure. I think that we have a threat between countries, states that are much like our own in the structural concept, meaning Russia and China are post-Westphalian states. There's a nation-state idea where states have integrity, states have to deal with each other, and although each of them tries to game the system, they are ruthless, they are self-interested, They don't particularly care for America and the notion of American culture and freedom spreading abroad. Basically, they're jockeying for position. They also differ from each other in ways which we can get into later. On the other hand, there's a tremendous threat, and it's reflected in Iran, and if you take a look at what's going on in the Middle East now, it's what's going on in the entirety of the Middle East, which is the collapse of that entire order of nation states. Now, those were always more fragile states. They were set up more recently, and they were set up really by outsiders who were colonialists on the way out. But ISIS, Iran, others, they have no interest in the nation-state system. They have an interest in domination. They have an interest in toppling nations and states. And when you have any project which is bent on destruction rather than creation, which they are, that's always easier. And if you have one which is able to accommodate or promote, let's say, 20% of the world, you have to take them very, very seriously. And when you have people who are very, very happy to die for it, rather than live for it, you have to take that very seriously. And so while I see Russia and China as competitive threats, and indeed dire competitive threats, we might be able to stare them down. It's harder to stare down an entire culture of over 1 billion people who are willing to immolate themselves as well as you. And just to take a look at what's going on now in the Middle East, and you see what they want to bring here to America.
So Jeff, basically what you see are revolutionaries that want to bring down the system, as opposed to big bad China and Russia, which actually do have nukes and long-range missiles, which terrorists don't have. But you see them as being trying to tear down the system, so that is a more fundamental threat.
Well, without having to grade the threats, I would say, yeah, in terms of a long-term view, like right now, Russia and China are willing to play with the Middle East. You know, Obama talked about pivoting to Asia. Well, China does not want Obama to pivot to Asia. They're not interested in America's attention on their sphere of influence. So they're very happy, even though they have their own Muslim terrorist problems, to foment problems for us in the Middle East. Russia, similarly, they, because they're a petrostate, rely heavily on OPEC and pricing, and so they're able to use the unrest in the Middle East to their advantage as well. And so, again, we're competing with Russia and China, and they pose competitive threats there, but all of us, including Russia and China, but America first, is really much in the crosshairs of Islamic terrorism.
So Amanda, what we really have is sort of convergence of problems. We have those who want to bring down the international system, and we also have the Chinese and the Russians who want to change that system in ways that would certainly make it worse. So we have both groups interacting at the same time.
Yes, I would agree with that statement.
Okay. Joseph, you look at a different part of the world than we normally examine. This is our own backyard. And when we think of Islamic terrorism, you know, of course we think about the Middle East, but there is terrorism also in Latin America. But in addition, you know, and this brings us back to Amanda, we have China and Russia very actively involved in a number of countries, one of them just 90 miles away from the state of Florida.
Yeah, well, thank you, Gordon. What you see in Latin America is a mutual exclusivity of all the threats that we described. There is Russia, there is China, there is Islamic terrorist networks, and of course there is Iran. And the concept, I spent a lot of time with the Department of Defense kind of wrestling on these issues, and they always remind me that while we have headaches in Latin America, we have migraines in the Middle East. So we have to be very conscious of that. But the concept of convergence and how these threats are aligning and unifying is something that we really need to study carefully. And where you see that convergence more particularly is in the threat finance domain. When you look at banks, when you look at accounts, when you look at transfers, I mean, especially when you look in Latin America, these are the same banks. I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work on Iran's activities, presence and activities in Latin America. During the height of the sanctions, during mid-2000s, in the height of the sanctions, Iran estimated was able to access, give or take, $16 to $17 billion through Latin American financial systems. A lot of that money that was being moved through Chinese banks. So China knows very well what goes on with Iran, with terrorism, and to some degree, I think in Latin America at least, they don't mind Iran doing some of that dirty work for them as long as it keeps the U.S. preoccupied and away from Asia and some of the interests they have there.
So really what we have is the intersection of China and terrorism and Iran in a place which is very close to where we live.
Yeah, well, at least in the level of threat finance, at least in that idea of moving money. In warfare, you have the 6 domains, right? The first, I'm sure everyone's aware of, air, sea, and land. But it's the last three that we have to be especially effective in, which is space, cyber, and the sixth, which is often not talked about, which is economic warfare. And over time, and one of the things I've been studying lately is the idea of creating an anti-dollar alliance amongst all these countries that are able to move past the different payment system, get out of the international SWIFT system, which Iran knows very well through sanctions, and Russia's been learning recently, and to find an alternative to that system so that they can move money in a much easier way.
Jeff?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that and say that, obviously, I think most people in this room may agree, I'm sure everyone on the panel agrees, that one of the primary problems we have in comparing the current regime in America to Ronald Reagan, and you start with a very stark statement, Gordon, of strength. But the truth of it is, we knuckle under to everyone. We're just weak. We find ourselves begging Iran to do deals with us when it's an absurdity. We don't need to beg Iran to do anything. We can force them to do what we want, and yet we beg them. But I'll just give you a little example, which may or may not be on people's radar screen. A number of years ago, I represented in Washington 12 American families who had family members who were victims of Palestinian terror. And they were killed or maimed, et cetera. And there are American laws to protect American citizens from terror, from foreign terror. And Congress passes these laws because they hope they'll be enforced at some point. And so the families sued the Palestinian Authority, which is also the PLO. It's the Palestinian Authority, the government of the Palestinians, is just another name for the PLO, which is the terror organization. And they're legally the same entity. And they sued both, and they won. And now, of course, in fact, they recently won a verdict of $655,500,000, a substantial verdict. So now the Obama administration is stepping in to set aside that verdict. So you talk about, it's not even a question of trying to hunt down the money of the terrorists before terror happens, to stop it, or to interdict it, to get in its way. We reward the terrorists. They kill Americans, and our administration steps in and eradicates our laws and says, okay, we prefer the terrorists to the victims.
Amanda, when we look at this, we have both China and Russia supporting the Palestinians, and we also have China and Russia supporting Iran. And this seems to me to where this makes Moscow and Beijing truly dangerous.
I would agree. I think that China and Russia and Iran all share the same interest of diminishing U.S. power, and one way to do that is acting in concert with one another to create a multipolar world in which America has less influence. And I would also argue, just building on what Jeff said, that when we project weakness, that emboldens our competitors and our enemies. Putin is a rational actor in Russia, and he, like most people, respects and understands strength. Thus, when he's faced with weakness in the form of our current administration, they probe the United States in a number of ways to test our strength in return. For example, think of Syria. Remember Obama's famous red line. If Assad used chemical weapons, the U.S. would probably start thinking about airstrikes in Syria. However, Putin in 2013 intervened, negotiated a deal in which Assad would be in charge of destroying the weapons. And just last week, I believe, there was evidence that Assad is using chemical chlorine bombs against the rebels. So this just shows that when the United States projects an image of weakness and doesn't do what it says it's going to do, then the enemies are emboldened.
And this is important, this whole idea of announcing a red line and then not enforcing it, because in the area of the world that I look, in Asia, this had enormous repercussions. So for instance, Japan is a treaty ally of the United States. We have an obligation to defend Japan. Well, the Japanese were unnerved by what happened in Syria because Tokyo said, well, look, President Obama, if you need to go to Congress to honor your treaty obligations with regard to Syria, what about us? What if the Chinese attack us? Are you going to have to go to get a resolution out of Washington? And also the South Koreans, another country. We have an obligation to defend South Korea. Seoul was very concerned about the United States' willingness to protect them against the North Koreans if we weren't willing to stand up at our red line. That is an issue that reverberated around Asia, and it took the administration more than a year to repair the damage.
Just to add one more thing about the Red Line and our allies, I would also like to point to the Baltic states, many of which are NATO members, and what happens if Putin does what he did in eastern Ukraine, which is not a NATO member. If Putin and Russia try to foment instability in a country like Estonia, for example, at what point does the U.S. respond? How would we respond? And does Putin believe that we would respond to protect our allies?
Joseph, it's important because, the United States seems to be distracted right now by all the things that Jeff and Amanda are talking about. It seems that there's been a long period of neglect. It's not only this administration, but the previous one as well, almost assuming that Latin America didn't really matter. The world sort of cut off at the Rio Grande. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. Listen, Latin America and Washington, as we all know, is often a foreign policy backwater. It's the afterthoughts, the thing you talk about at the end of a meeting. And there's an old adage in boxing, right? I used to box when I was younger in the Marine Corps, which is it's the punch that you don't see that knocks you out. And what I worry about is that in Latin America, all our adversaries that we're wrestling with in other parts of the world, in Asia, in Eastern Central Europe, in the Middle East, are understanding that concept and understanding that they're diminishing their geographical disadvantage that they've had over time, but not in a conventional sense. They're not going to be sending carriers to the Caribbean or long-range bombers. Maybe Russia will one day, but they're doing it in an asymmetric sense. And in Latin America today, there is no more U.S. allies. Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro has pretty much changed the climate of public opinion that I wouldn't trust any of those governments to really hold a candle to China, Russia, or Iran if they were really to act against U.S. interests in the region.
And what is the reaction in the region to Washington's outreach to Havana?
Well, to Havana particularly, look, there's no bigger joke in Latin America than to say, I'm from Washington, I'm here to help. That doesn't get you very far anymore. Cuba, and this is the thing I want to clarify about Cuba. Cuba is not just any other country, as some people will make us believe in the media. They say we have relations with worse human rights violators, but Cuba is a country that has consistently tried to attack the United States historically over the last 50 years, has penetrated our government at levels that most people outside of the counterintelligence community don't truly understand, probably just next to the Russians and the Chinese. And the Cubans have had the most aggressive foreign policy in Latin America, where they punch well above their weight. They've intervened all over the region and literally control certain governments, including the Venezuelan government, the Bolivian government, Ecuadorian government, etc. And they do that through information. Because what the Cubans understand is while they don't have money and they don't have oil, what they do have is a very, very robust and effective intelligence system. And they go to these countries and they control the immigration systems so that they have eyes and ears all over the country and can hold that leverage to bend these countries to their will.
And Jeff, you were talking about Iran's connections with the regions, which actually make and enhance Cuba's threat to the United States and to its friends, right?
Well, certainly. First of all, Iran, and Joseph knows this probably better than I do because of his focus in Latin America, Iran doesn't only foment terrorism around the world generally, but very specifically in many areas in Latin America. They've been very active. I think everyone remembers the bombing of the Argentinian Jewish Center, and that was later revealed to be Iran. But they are very active and have been for quite some time. I just wanted to reflect back on something you talked about, how this government doesn't, it talks about red lines, but it never really enforces them. Here's the thing. I agree that they don't enforce them against the bad guys. They will enforce them against our friends. And that's one of the problems that Israel confronts right now, because part of this fantastic deal that we're cutting with the Iranians has in it that America is guaranteeing the Iranians that we will protect their nuclear program. Now, who are we protecting their nuclear program from primarily? Well, the Israelis. Because the Israelis have been trying to undermine the nuclear program in many different ways, cyber and more than cyber, and they've gone after their scientists as well over the years. And America is now agreeing that we're going to protect the Iranian development of nuclear weapons from the Israelis. And guess what? That's a red line that they're going to keep.
What's really just astounding about this is that Iran's nuclear program has really advanced, not because Iranian technicians are the best in the world, but because they've had help. So for instance, they have a very strong and robust relationship with the North Koreans. At this particular moment, there are Iranian technicians in North Korea at a military base 53 miles south of the Chinese border. They've been there since October 2012. That's an important date because that's the month after both Iran and North Korea signed a technical cooperation agreement. So it's basically, you got that. You have the North Koreans transiting missiles to Iran over Chinese airspace. Clearly Beijing knows. The Bush administration knew about this and did nothing about it.
Yeah, and in terms of the effect, we talk about a threat to the world order, talk about a threat to America. And I don't mean the world order in the negative way, I mean in the positive way, which is the current world order in which really America has been a dominant force for so long, and although it's obviously receding very quickly in our time and declining. But the threat is vast because this kind of destabilization, I was at a meeting with, back-to-back meetings with the Israeli ambassador and then the Egyptian ambassador, and their messages were virtually identical, except the Egyptian ambassador was much more upset about it because the Israelis already have nuclear weapons and the Egyptians don't yet. But he basically, it was a number of congressmen, me and a couple of other people, and he just swore to us. He says, I swear to you that this deal gets done. The Saudis will have a nuclear weapon, they'll buy it from Pakistan the next day, and we will the next week. Now, think about that, because to the degree that nuclear proliferation is a threat anywhere in the world, it's the biggest threat in that region of the world. And for 50 years, since 1966, all the countries in the region have complained about Israel having nuclear weapons. They've complained about it, but they've done nothing. Because while they complain about it, they know that it actually stabilizes the region. They know that Israel's nukes are there only for deterrence. As soon as they hear Iranians, as soon as they hear this deal might get done, and this is how you know who to trust on the deal, right? Because one side is saying this deal will stop Iranians from getting the bomb. The other side is saying, no, it'll help them get the bomb. Well, how do you know who to trust? Well, now the Egyptians, the Turks, the Saudis, they're all vowing to get nuclear weapons as a result of this deal. Because what they know about Israel is they'll only use it to deter. What they know about Iran is they will use it to completely topple the entire area, completely topple the regimes, and that's a direct threat to us.
And that brings us really to Amanda's friends, because when we talk about Iran's nuclear program, we got to talk about the assistance they've gotten from another quarter. Apart from the Chinese, apart from the North Koreans, they're also the Russians.
Yes, Russia is definitely in favor of the Iranian nuclear deal. It was Russia that requested that the missile and arms embargoes on Iran be dropped as part of the deal, and that's of course to benefit Russia so that they can sell those things. Just in recent weeks, Putin announced that Russia would lift its self-imposed ban on the delivery of S-300 surface-to-air missiles in order to sell 4 of them to Iran. Furthermore, as part of the nuclear deal, Russia is supposed to enforce the terms of the deal and to act as a guarantor of the consequences associated with noncompliance. Do we think that Russia will do that?
And what you have really is Russia seeded the Iranian nuclear program with the reactor at Bushehr, and it also seeded the North Korean program with the reactor at Yongbin, which is close to Pyongyang. So here we have the world's most destructive weapons are being disseminated by Moscow. So Jeff, doesn't that sort of make you feel a little bit concerned about the Chinese and the Russians? I don't want to dump on you, of course, but you know.
Feel free. I'm not unconcerned about the Chinese and the Russians at all. I'm simply saying that while they compete with us, they would like their own regimes to survive. I don't know how much longer, and Gordon, you were mentioning this yesterday, we were talking about it. We'll see how much longer the Chinese will survive in the current regime. Putin seems to be, it's a very interesting dynamic where it looks like a country, but it's more like an empire. It's more like his personal plaything. But you know, there are forces that have some form of stability and want to have control and dominance, and they are not our friends. They are our enemies in many respects. But that doesn't mean that they seek to completely destroy the world. Listen, the notion in Islam of a dollar harb and a dollar Islam is real. The notion of this caliphate now is real. They're trying to take, the same way Russia would like to have an expanded empire, maybe back to the days of the Tsar or the days of the USSR. These guys want to really take over the entire world. And it's a threat because there seem to be no limitations. While it's true that Russia and China can be brutal to their own people, and they have been brutal to their own people, I think possibly and maybe a slight order of magnitude above that is what you see in the Middle East in terms of the internecine warfare there and the complete and utter obliteration using all kinds of unconventional weapons against their own populations.
And when we have, for instance, the intersection of big states that don't like us, the Chinas and the Russias of the world, and terrorists and nuclear weapons, then it really becomes dangerous because then you have all the bad actors working closely together. Sometimes coordinating, sometimes not, but nonetheless, you see a coordination of interest. Let's turn to the Latin America again, because here, this is one area where we don't pay that much attention, and we have all of these bad actors working at the same time. Joseph?
Yeah, Gordon, let me just make a comment on the Iran deal, so that you spend some time focusing on that. One of the things we're not talking about when it comes to the Iran deal, at least some of us aren't talking about, at least in the media, of course it's a concern that there's billions of dollars about to be transferred to the Islamic Republic, but more than the money, as important as the legitimacy that they're gaining. And that legitimacy that they get is going to have worldwide implications. Because of the work I've done in Latin America, if there's one thing that's held Iran back, is the fact that they're still looked like as kind of a rogue state by most governments in the region. They're a little bit careful to do business with them. And that may change as they get more money and get more credibility and get more legitimacy to do work in Latin America. You gotta remember what Jeff was mentioning earlier, the AMI attack, the bombing in Buenos Aires in 1994, that was the second largest Islamist terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere. I see before 9/11, that was the largest Islamist terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere. And there was an attack 2 years before it on the Israeli embassy in the same city. Iran has a history of terrorism, and that terrorism extends to our hemisphere. Just in the last 10 years, Iran has tried to attack the United States publicly. This is not getting into any classified stuff, at least 3 times. In 2006, Iran was involved with an Islamist terrorist group in Trinidad to try to blow up John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. In 2011, they tried to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. as he dined in a restaurant. And that turned out to be a real case. That was a real Quds Force operative that was behind that. And in 2011 as well, they tried to engage in a cyber plot to attack our nuclear plants through Mexico. And so Iran has become increasingly aggressive at the same time that Russia has started to talk about opening bases in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and China footing the bill. And China has essentially been paying pretty much, if you look at Chinese investments in Latin America, it's not, and I'm sure our next panel could tell you, it's not traditional economic investments. They're not investing in the biggest economic prospects. They're investing in political projects that allow them to have political influence so that they can control the region. In intelligence, we call this IPB, Intelligence Preparation of the Battlefield. It's a long operation to create the battle space so that you can have more legitimacy and influence, and that's what's happening down south.
So Joseph, you're talking about money, and maybe it's not all about money, but money is very important because as Dan talked about in his opening remarks, Ronald Reagan realized that a strong national security ultimately rested on a strong economy. And he really applied this lesson. And it's dangerous for me to talk about Russian history sitting next to a Russian historian, but just excuse me for just a few moments. One of the things that Reagan did in the 1980s was to weaken the Soviet Union by working with Saudi Arabia and others to lower the price of commodities around the world. And the reason he did that, of course, was because high commodity prices, oil for metals and the rest of it, were fueling Soviet expansionism. And the question right now is, we're in an environment of very low commodity prices. And the ultimate irony is everyone hates the Iran deal, as I do. No one hates it more than I do, actually. But the point is, it has one minor benefit. And that is, it is reducing the price of hydrocarbons around the world. So Amanda, you focused in on this issue of security and oil prices. I mean, how do you see this?
Well, oil and gas exports, I think they comprise something like 50% of Russia's operating budget and 15% of the GDP. So oil funds all of Russia's activities, but the recent drop in oil prices has really affected the Russian economy. I think oil is at something like $39 a barrel, and according to recent analysis, it should be at least $45 a barrel to really be stabilizing, to enable these countries like Russia to fund their military and keep the population stable. So I think that the drop in oil prices, and especially if the Iran deal goes through, then there's even more supply on the market. So that is one factor that will definitely shake things up, continue to shake things up, and cause some potential instability in places like Venezuela and Russia that rely so much on oil and gas for their budgets.
So Joseph, here we have this issue of low oil and gas prices. Every time I drive, and when I'm low on gas, this is when it really tests my resolve of being a good American. And there's a Citgo gas station, and I think I really need to fill up, but I never do it. And what's the reason why I don't do that?
Well, Citgo used to be a Venezuelan state-owned oil company. It was basically a subsidiary of PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan state-owned enterprise. They actually sold Citgo because they're broke.
Oh, you mean I can actually
You
fill
can
up
get-
there
yes,
now?
in a clean conscience, you could fill up at Citgo.
Okay. The question, though, is what happens to President Maduro's government now that you have much lower oil prices? You have a very inefficient state oil company in Venezuela. Do we see better or do we see worse behavior out of Venezuela?
In Venezuela, what you have is what you call wounded dog syndrome. I mean, they're on their last life. The PDVSA is broke. The only rentable activity inside PDVSA is no longer producing petroleum. It's laundering money. That's really how you make money inside the Venezuelan state-owned enterprise. But I think where you want to pay attention, this is a coming crisis that everyone needs to pay attention because it's very close to our shores. It's actually on our shores, which is the Caribbean. Venezuela has subsidized, basically bought out the Caribbean. This is one of Hugo Chavez's political legacies through subsidized oil. He basically gave oil at a heavily discounted, 50% up discounted rate and bought certain countries that now depend on that oil. If that oil stops coming, I mean, these countries are going to go into a tailspin and a chaos, and our generals and our military commanders in Southern Command are very much paying attention to this because if that affects the Caribbean, which is considered our third border, that's just one step up moving further north. And let me just make one point, Gordon, on this, just to touch on what we were talking about petropolitics. We have a huge opportunity, and you know, I specialize in the Western Hemisphere, so that actually includes going all the way up to Canada. And you know, while we're talking a lot of threats and a lot of problems and challenges in the world, and especially we're talking geopolitics, and to win in the geopolitical battle, you need to develop narratives. And there is no stronger narrative, potential narrative, than in North America. And I think that is an alliance that has been weakened, that has not been discussed, and that needs to be reinvigorated. I mean, Canada is one of our strongest allies in the world. They're one of the strongest countries on Iran. They've taken a leadership role, but we continue to neglect them on energy, on immigration, on a variety of issues. And then there's Mexico. Mexico concerns me. Mexico, at the same time that their historically state-owned energy enterprise, Pemex, has just opened up, which is a historic opportunity to be able to put them into this North American energy renaissance. OPEC has been lobbying them very heavily because the last thing OPEC wants, and this will really suppress the prices of oil, is if Mexico production starts to become much more cost effective. And so there's a huge fight in Mexico. It's a very silent fight in Mexico that no one's watching between these countries, Iran, Russia, OPEC members, Venezuela, and the US and Canada. So I think that's something we need to pay attention to.
I forgot about Canada, and when you said Canada, I was thinking Keystone Pipeline. So this whole issue of energy and security, Jeff, I remember one of the most vivid images of the beginning of ISIS's advance through Iraq was really they're taking over refineries and actually becoming a large seller of oil in global markets.
Right. Right now, I think they're up to about $500 million. They haven't advanced yet to the point of turning it into a business, except to fund their own efforts. But yes, they're in control. They're in certain places they're torching it. In certain places they're developing and selling it. But that itself is another destabilizing factor. But yeah, ISIS, as it takes territory, is definitely changing the dynamic. Which, going back to the original premise, which is Russia and China. You know, and again, sitting next to a Russian and Chinese expert, I also am a little bit concerned about saying what I don't know. But just from what I see, Russia, which is heavily reliant on being a petrostate for its economy, China is heavily reliant on being a buyer because it doesn't really have natural resources in that respect and relies on dirty coal mostly. And so there's an interesting dynamic there where each one has a role to play and is extremely interested in what's going to happen to control of the oil fields in the Middle East.
You know, one of the things that it seems to me to be really important is that we started out by talking about who's worse. You know, is it the big states or is it those who wants to change the state system? But when you have ISIS actually owning oil refineries, actually exercising governmental functions, we have perhaps the worst of all possible worlds. We have people who want to bring down the international system, but getting the power of a nation state.
I think you just agreed with me. I think you might have.
Okay.
Okay.
Amanda, you know, and we step back and look at what Reagan did to take down the Soviet Union. We do have sanctions on Russia right now. They seem to have hurt a little bit, but they don't seem to have stopped Russia's provocative moves in Ukraine, and I didn't say the Ukraine, in Ukraine, and also we see, as you just referred to, possibly threatening the Baltic states. The question is, do we need to have tougher sanctions? And if we do, how do we put these sanctions on? I mean, we're not going to get very much support from the Europeans. How do we do this?
That's a great question, Gordon. I believe that we should definitely continue to use sanctions as a tool to achieve diplomatic ends. There's a great maxim, when the treasury is empty, the regime falls, and I think that holds true. During the 80s, Reagan helped exacerbate the financial difficulties of the Soviet Union by supporting anti-communist insurgent movements in Nicaragua and Afghanistan as part of the Reagan doctrine. So the USSR was forced to spend money, and that made their budget grow tighter and helped contribute to their collapse. So I think that that's an essential thing to do today. And I think we are seeing a bit of a slowdown in Ukraine. There's been a ceasefire since February, although there has been some shelling, but there's definitely been a slowdown. Is that in part because of Russia's financial difficulties? Perhaps. But I would also argue that that conflict is definitely not over, because if you think of Russia and then Ukraine, and then Crimea is south of Ukraine, Russia doesn't have access to Crimea where their navy is based, and so Russia is not going to stop until they can get access to that naval base, and one way to do that is by creating a path through eastern Ukraine. So I think we need to not let our guard down, and one way is to keep the sanctions up.
In the beginning, before we started, a woman with a black sweater who's right up there was talking to me about China and Russia using their economic power against the United States. And this all ties in with the sanctions on Russia. It ties in with the strength of Venezuela. And again, of course, with what ISIS can do with all of that oil revenue. So that really changes the dynamics. You know, one thing that we forget, and this is important, you know, in terms of optimism, the United States has a strong, resilient, and a very deep economy right now. The one thing that we don't have, and this is not just a fault of the current administration, but nonetheless, you see it today in Washington, it's much more pronounced. There really is this failure of will. This is all goes back to Ronald Reagan in terms of where we stand today. You know, there are many tyrants and terrorists in this world, and there always will be. But what makes them truly dangerous is that the free states pursue misguided policies. And today, you know, we start to talk about how, oh, we need to win hearts and minds throughout the world. Well, no. What we need to do is just win. You know, Reagan was right. There is an ability of the United States to change the world. And as we just heard in this panel from these three panelists, we now have the obligation to do so, and we must also do so. Thank you very much for being here today.